We continue today to look at the series Molded by the Master. Has God been molding you this week? Well, that's a foolish question, isn't it? Of course God's been molding you this week. But the real question is, have you been aware that God is molding you this week? You see, God's molding, and sometimes we resist His molding. Because I don't like what they said about me. I don't like that my boss got on me. I don't like, and why is this happening? This is unfair, that's unfair. And God be molding on our lives, trying to shape us to be some ugly old org. No, that's not. But why do we sometimes feel that way? Why do we resist God? He's working in our lives. He loves us. We know He loves us. He tells us He loves us. And yet, we resist. I was at a nonstop conference this week. Left Thursday, and I didn't get to bed before 12 o'clock, Thursday or Friday night, and it was teaching time, almost nonstop. Friday night, or Thursday night after the teaching and that, we had a time of worship. And then the fellow that was leading it, he asked us, what's a promise verse that you know? So I want you to think about that. And we're going to go around in a minute. We're going to share those. And then he said, what's an alignment verse? These are pretty much mostly pastors. There's a few, one guy's a pit. Jason knows what that's like. Pastor in training kind of a thing, you know. And I remember when that's like, you do everything. And if the pastor doesn't want to do it, you do it. And so it was kind of funny when he said he was a pit. I'd never heard that used in that context. I thought it was pretty good, though. Because that's being molded and shaped. But think about that. A promise verse and an alignment verse. You say we don't think that way. We usually don't recognize that God is trying to align our lives. Boy, when he asked that, I thought, man, I'm glad I'm about the middle. You know why? Gives you time to think. Man, if you're the first one and you're, wow, alignment verse. Well, what does God what verse? Do you know a verse that He's trying to get you back in line? When you're molded by the Master, He's going to align you. And if He's not, well, He is, but you're missing it. You're fighting it. You're resisting it. God is trying to align us all the time because He's trying to mold us into His purpose, that which He wants us to be, conformed to the image of Christ. And, you know, how do you say that's a bad thing? So why do we wind up resisting Him? Just something to think about as we continue on this. Today we're going to be looking at Matthew. And I'll tell you up front, not a lot of verses about Matthew. We have a few. Mark 2:14 and Matthew 9:9. There's just not a lot. In all likelihood, none of the 12 was a more notorious sinner than Matthew. And think about that. Paul says, you know, man, I'm the worst of sinners. Well, Matthew, what's his function in life at this time? Matthew is a tax collector. Matthew is Jewish and a Jewish tax collector. He's a publican. And when Jesus, and that's the condition he's in when Jesus calls him. He's a publican, he's a tax collector, and he is the last credentialed individual you would expect to find as an apostle. A tax collector, someone that the Jewish people hated, and yet this man is called to be an apostle, he's called to be a leader of the church, he's called to be a preacher of the gospel. Because, you see, tax collectors were the most despised people in Israel. Think about that. They were the most despised. They were hated. They were vilified. They were looked down upon by the entire Jewish community. They were deemed lower than those that supported Herod, the Herodians, Herod's dynasty. They were low because they were not pure Jews. But the tax collectors are even lower than that. And they were more worthy of scorn than the Roman occupiers. It's another incredible thought. They hated the Romans. But they hated even more so the tax collectors. Publicans were men who bought a tax franchise. And we don't buy tax franchises today, but you can buy a Burger King franchise and you can buy a lot of other franchises. But imagine if we had IRS tax franchises. They're already the criminal arm of the government. I mean, no, I didn't mean that. They already are in our pockets plenty. Imagine if they bought that franchise. They wanted to make that money back. They gave money to the Roman emperor, the very enemies of the Jewish people. They extorted money from the Jews. They padded their own pockets. They would oftentimes, most times, raise the taxes. There were certain taxes they couldn't be, but they would tax other things. They would have excise taxes, road taxes. Oh, you have too much weight on that donkey. There's an extra tax there. And so they would just continue to raise those taxes. They were despicable, vilified, and unscrupuled individuals. They were scoundrels. That's how the Jewish people looked at them. Now imagine that's how people looked at you. Would you feel like you'd have very many friends? You know, every place you went, people looked down upon you. It's tough enough in our schools today to be a teenager, to be a kid. That doesn't only have to be in high school. It could be in any of the grades. It's tough enough because you're trying to measure up. You want to have friends. And boy, Gloria and I were talking about that this week. And you know what? Kids don't necessarily understand that you can have more than one friend. Well, you're my friend. Well, I'm this person's friend. I can't be your friend anymore. What's with that? We so limit ourselves. But imagine being one that nobody wanted to be your friend. The movie that just showed the youth and going to be shown to their friends to save a life. I had to think of the title of it. Boy, that gives you a picture of a couple of kids that are kind of ostracized by the world. Doesn't feel too good. Doesn't feel good at all. In fact, we find kids today more and more thinking of hurting themselves to try to get attention instead of trying to live in this positive format that the Lord's presenting. That's the life of a publican. That was the life of a tax collector. Matthew was a tax collector turned disciple and later writes the gospel. Look in Mark chapter 2, verse 14. It says, and as he passed by, he saw, it says here, Levi, that's his Jewish name, son of Alphaeus. And he's at work when Jesus sees him. He's working, collecting taxes. And he said to him, follow me. And he, Matthew, Levi, arose and followed him. Matthew 9, verse 9. And as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax office. And he said to him, follow me. And he arose and followed. Matthew describing himself in one short verse. Doesn't give us much information. He only refers to himself as Matthew here. And Luke refers to him as Matthew. Well, here and then when he lists the 12 apostles, he uses his name Matthew. That's really all he mentions about himself. We don't know a lot. And this call of Matthew comes out of nowhere. It is completely catching you by surprise. You're reading along and Jesus calls the most hated of the Jewish people. Calls a man, and the ironic part is the guy follows. How many times has Jesus called you to follow him and his will and his way? How often do we, instead of getting up and following, walking away from what we know is wrong or not the right way, and do what we want to do? Follow me. Not much that Jesus says to him. He just says, follow me. He doesn't give him any explanation. He doesn't try to persuade him or anything. He just says, follow me. I want you to consider for a while the conversion of Matthew. As the author of the gospel, you might expect there to be a lot of information about him because he is. He's the author. We know more about John. We know more about Peter. We know more about Paul. We know more about a lot of the other disciples than what we really know about Matthew because there's not a lot said. We might expect to hear more about his character, but it's all limited to his identity as a tax collector. The only thing that we know is that he was modest. How do we know he was modest? Because he doesn't write much about himself. He doesn't say much, and he's reserved. He's a fairly quiet individual. Stays in the background. Oh, today we fight sometimes in the church to be up in the foreground. I don't get enough recognition in the background. But Matthew was content being in the background. I imagine part of that might have been because he was in the foreground so much and so hated because of what he did that maybe it was just easier to stay there. But Matthew gives us a lengthy account of the life of Jesus. Doesn't say much about himself. In his entire gospel, as I said, he mentions himself twice. And that's it. Matthew, more than any other disciple. Think about this. Did you know what was expected when you became a Christian? Did you have I have a real clear understanding that it's going to cost. I thought when I became a Christian and wrote to my mother and my family and told them I was a Christian, I thought they'd be happy. I did not have a clue how they would really feel. And when my mother said, God gave you a brain, why don't you use it? It's like, wow. I thought I had a brain, and I thought I'm using it for the first time. And but they were upset, and I got nasty letters about that. Matthew had a clear idea of what it was going to cost him to follow Jesus. More than any other of the apostles and probably disciples, he had a clear idea of what it would cost him. Upon leaving that tax booth, he was guaranteed of one thing for sure: unemployment. Guaranteed. Because there was other people standing in line. Hey, it was a profitable business. You could make some good money on it. You might be hated, but you could do okay. And for him to leave that would have meant to have nothing after that. Many other disciples, they could have returned to fishing. In fact, doesn't Peter and them return to fishing for at least a day or part of a day after Jesus is crucified? Man, I'm going to go fishing. I'm going to go back to what I know. Can Matthew go back to what he knows? He's forfeited all that. He's walked away from it. He has proclaimed Jesus as being his head and his leader. And what did he have? Jesus says, consider the cost. Consider the cost. And I wonder how much Matthew in that moment, because that's all really what he had was a moment, did he consider the cost? Did he say, you know what? I have seen Jesus. I've heard Jesus. Man, I want to be with him. I don't know, because we don't have a lot of other things said. All we know is that he was called and he left everything behind. Well, Jesus says, don't turn around and look back. You walk away. Don't go backwards. Continue to move forward in your life. And Matthew does that. On your outline, we find two changes happen to Matthew when he decided to follow Jesus. Jesus gave him a new life. A new life. And you know what? That hasn't changed today. If you've asked Jesus to be your Savior, he gave you a new life. And that's why you have to consider, am I resisting that life? He not only belonged to a new group, he belonged to the Son of God. See, we need to think that way. We need to think that way. We need to teach our kids to think that way, because life is tough. And if we can teach them and help them to realize they belong, boy, I was older when I became a Christian. I realized that I was joining a new family. My family was rejecting everything that I had turned to. And I was going to be in a new family, and the church has been my family. Has been that. When we went to see Amanda and Glenn, we went into Omaha. We stayed overnight at my friend Bill and his wife Colleen's house, and Gloria hadn't seen them in over 20 years. Amanda and I stayed there when we came back from Liberty when she got married. 20 years not seeing her. You would not believe that when we sat at the table when Bill was standing out in front of the house when we pulled up, And he gave Gloria a big hug. And when Colleen came in, she gave Gloria a big hug.